Europe, the summer of 1914. The world was in transition, but few realized the full extent of the changes. In Vienna, Paris, Berlin, they strolled the boulevards, sipped coffee in cafes, dined by gaslight chandeliers, but beneath the surface of that peace and prosperity was a continent up to the brink of disaster, a continent well-fed, but fragile in the decades before World War I. Europe was crisscrossed by some of the most advanced and intricate food networks the world had ever seen. Steamships carried exotic goods from colonies and trade partners, coffee from Brazil, bananas from the Caribbean, tea from India, spices from Southeast Asia. They were enormous agricultural powerhouses in their own right, but also hugely reliant on these global imports to feed their burgeoning urban populations. The working-class diet. For the working classes in cities like Manchester or Leipzig or St. Petersburg, daily meals were moderate but stable. Bread was the stuff of life, rye in the east, wheat in the west, butter or lard was thinly scraped on. Stews occasionally included meat, most often pork and beef. Potatoes were ubiquitous. Daily wine was the drink of the common man in France. In Germany, beer, although rudimentary by the standards of today, hygiene had improved by the late 19th century, through the design of better plumbing systems and the establishment of sanitation reforms. But even under peacetime conditions, the systems were brittle. Cities relied upon railroads and imports. Apparently few households produced their own food. Cities were teeming with urban slums, and while health movements were beginning, diseases in the form of tuberculosis and cholera persisted. Mobilization when food is used as a weapon. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, would trigger a chain of events that would quickly alter the face of Europe. Within weeks, empires mobilized millions of men, trains were turned into troop transports, and borders hardened. But the impact on food was swift and crippling. Railways requisitioned. Goods that had flowed, grain, fruit and vegetables, were suddenly stuck. What had previously been cattle cars were now filled with artillery. Across Germany and Austria-Hungary, food that had long traveled hundreds of miles from the countryside farms to the city tables was snared by logistical chaos. Blockades begin. Britain's naval blockade of Germany was one of the defining features of World War I. The British Royal Navy, which dominated crucial seaways, started intercepting supplies that ships were taking to the Central Powers. The result was a slow starvation, not just of the military, but of populations in a whole country. The German response, unrestricted submarine warfare, would in time draw the United States into the war. But before that, it added to a growing sense of panic across Germany and Austria. Flour, sugar, butter all became scarce. Alternatives were sought. Ersatz coffee, ersatz bread, ersatz everything. Civilian hygiene, the forgotten casualty. When we think of war, we tend to think of bullets, bombs, and trenches. But war is also waged in kitchens, bathrooms and hospitals. Urban sanitation collapses as men departed for the front. Cities were deprived of laborers, garbage collectors, maintenance crews. Slums, already crowded, became pools of contagion. Soap grew scarce. Water infrastructure crumbled under strain. The scourge of typhus and the lice that spread its chain of infection became an epidemic in Russia. In the Balkans, cholera returned. Hospitals overwhelmed. In France, hospitals were filling up with soldiers wounded in war, but they also had to care for malnourished children and elderly civilians with pneumonia. The story of civilian sanitation is one of the least told in the whole war, but it is there every day. Arts propaganda and the empty PLA. By the end of 1914, governments had realized that they were hardly fighting enemy armies alone, but rather hunger, despair, and disillusionment. On the home front, propaganda became essential. Food posters, save the wheat, eat less meat, help win the war. In Britain, rationing never became official until later in the war, but propaganda started early. Posters promoted backyard gardens, less consumption, and even self-policing, reporting neighbors who hoarded or wasted food. Women step in. Sons went to war. Women became farmers, factory workers, caretakers. The Women's Land Army in Britain was one such example. Thousands of women leaving cities to work the land, providing actual food to the nation. But not even their work could stop the steady erosion of quality and diversity of food. Inside, the war room's tactics of starvations. Soon both sides understood that food, or the lack of it, could break morale. And in Germany, the High Command thought that starving the British out to surrender through submarine attacks was going to accomplish something. In Britain, the belief persisted that Germany could be brought to its knees by an economic stranglehold. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and both sides began to feel the costs of that strategy. Internal collapse of Germany has started with food. Riots broke out in Berlin and Munich between 1915 and 1916. Long lines snaked outside bakeries in Vienna. Hunger became political. The Tsar's failure to feed the cities in Russia helped provoke revolution. Disease as the hidden front line. As hygiene worsened, lice spread everywhere, in the trenches and in the cities. Lice brought typhus. Rats disseminated disease and ruined food supplies. Soap became a luxury. Clean underwear, a distant memory. The human cost of deprivation. Historians now calculate that more than 400,000 German civilians perished due specifically to starvation and hygiene-related diseases in the war. In Austria-Hungary, it was worse. And, in the Ottoman Empire, the Allied tight blockade and local incompetence led to one of World War I's greatest humanitarian disasters in Lebanon. Syria and Palestine where a famine struck. And that was just the start. Conclusion: a world already changed. Narrator, voiceover. It's by the end of 1914. It was so clear this would be no short war. It wouldn't be a good old gentleman's duel or a battle of honor. It was to be total war. Every factory, every farm, every kitchen, every sewer was to be involved. The food you ate or didn't. The water you drank or couldn't. The soap you had or lacked. These things too would mold the fate of the world as much as bullets and treaties. The frontline kitchen. What to eat and why. The soldiers on both sides of the Western Front had at least one thing in common: unpredictable food. The average German, British, French, or Belgian, trapped in a trench, seldom had much food to eat at all. Rations were intended to provide nutrition, but things did not quite turn out that way. British rations on paper: 1 pound of meat per day, 1.25 pounds of bread bacon. The fruit spread jam, tea and sugar, and salt, occasionally vegetables, and cheese. But in reality, men typically received hardtack biscuits, so hard they could be carved. Watered-down stew that was sometimes called makoniki, a canned concoction of turnips, potatoes, and mystery meat. And weak tea. French soldiers, poilus, enjoyed better food when the supply lines held. Their diet could consist of bread, cheese, wine, and stew. But with the heavy shelling, even that was gone. During the early phase of the war, German soldiers were well fed, receiving sausages, black bread and soup. But by 1915, the British blockade began to take its toll. Turnips became a staple. Meat disappeared. Ersatz substitute food became widespread. Ersatz coffee made from acorns. Ersatz sausage made from old meat remnants and fillers of sawdust. Cooking in Hell, a picture history of the 361st Infantry Regiment of the United States Army, American Expeditionary Forces 1917-1919 for wider. Robert J. Good, $47.65, FD French, Deluxe Doughboys. The American Expeditionary Forces in World War I General Military. Myron J. Smith Jr., 4.4 out of 5 stars, 9_menu. Home, Our Books _SF-model-6_SF-model-5_SF-model-3_SF-model-4_SF-model-1 Gallery. Online store checkout my account FAQ. Contact us packet in time. Free shipping on qualifying offers. There were no trenches stoves. Meals were prepared at field kitchens, generally behind the lines, and carried up by weary supply men through miles of mud, gunfire and confusion. Bully beef and biscuits. British soldiers would joke that they were fighting not against the Germans but against boredom. And bully beef, as the canned corned beef, greasy and flavorless but dependable, was known. It was loaded with salt, which made the men constantly thirsty, an issue when clean water was in short supply. Food, theft, and trade. Hungry men get creative. Troops bartered alongside locals, scavenged from deserted farms, and often traded among themselves. Tobacco for chocolate, soap for tea. Officers usually had better food, frequently supplemented from home. But for the ordinary soldier, every meal was a roll of the dice. Rats, lice, and history. The great hygiene fallacy: if food was a problem, hygiene was a horror story. Lice, the constant companions, called chats. Lice crawled all over every uniform, burrowed into the seams, and laid eggs with ruthless effectiveness. Soldiers scratched to the point that some developed trench sores. Delousing stations in available uniforms were burned or boiled. But lice always came back. Rats the size of cats. Rats gorged themselves on corpses. They swarmed by the thousands in the trenches, bold and fat. They nibbled at boots, gnawed on sleeping soldiers' faces, and helped spread disease. There are tales of soldiers waking up to find rats crawling over their chests. Sanitation, almost non-existent. Toilets were trenches referred to as latrines, or, sarcastically, thunderboxes. It was lacking toilet paper, leaves, rags, or old newspaper would have to do. Rain frequently overflowed into the latrines, spreading human waste into sleeping areas. Dysentery was common. The smell was unbearable. Water, a battle of its own soldiers, required water to drink, to cook with, and to wash themselves with. Yet in the trenches, clean water was in short supply. Shell fire often ruptured wells. Streams flowed brown with mud and decay. Men scrambled to gather rainwater or filter what they could find through socks. Tea was a help. Boiling the water killed some disease-causing bacteria, but cholera, dysentery, and typhoid outbreaks were frequent, suffering the emotional cost of poor hygiene and hunger-filth fatigue. There's a kind of despair that settles in when your skin never feels clean, when you stink and can't wash it away. The realization that they may have to continue indefinitely under the conditions which a perpetual grime brought upset the soldiers more than being shot at. The British Army Medical Corps noted that unhygienic conditions resulted in low morale and mental health. Some soldiers experienced trench madness, a combination of shell shock, malnourishment, and sensory overload. Letters from the front, personal accounts, speak volumes. One British soldier wrote, "We haven't washed in 2 weeks. We sleep with lice and rats. I'd give my rifle for a real bath." One other, a French soldier, put it more simply, "I stink of death and filth. But still, I fight." Attempts to get clean little victories, field showers and baths. When soldiers had been rotated back from the front and taken to field camps with showers, it was a rare thing. Clothes were boiled, lice were picked off with knives, and hair was shorn. There were these moments, treasures, a street that was calm and quiet, just a fleeting sense that things are still all right in a world gone bonkers. Toothbrushes and shaving kits. NCOs were required to shave regularly, even while in the trenches. As an example to follow, some soldiers converted sticks and salt into makeshift toothbrushes. Yet with food rotting their teeth and no dental care, their oral health began to decline so rapidly. The comfort parcels, letters, and packages from home became lifelines. British and French families dispatched soap, socks, toothbrushes, chocolate, and cigarettes. It was more welcome than bullets to many a soldier. It made him human, at least for a wash cycle. Disease. The invisible frontline trenches were rife with sickness, with men pressed shoulder to shoulder, overstressed, malnourished, and dirty. Infections spread like wildfire. Trench foot is the result of prolonged feet exposure to damp, unsanitary, and cold conditions. Their feet would swell, blister, and turn black. Amputation is required in severe cases. Trench mouth, a painful gum infection that occurs from inadequate dental hygiene and results in bleeding, pain, ulcers, and decay of the teeth. Influenza, especially bad during the final year of the war, before the 1918 pandemic struck, killing more than 50 million people worldwide. How did they survive? Discipline, humor, and habit. Despite it all, soldiers adapted. Gallows humor helped. Trench culture included nicknames for food, songs about rats, and jokes about lice. Even the very simplest hygiene routines became rites of survival. Camaraderie. Misery shared is misery halved. Soldiers scrubbed each other's backs, plucked lice off one another, and passed around stolen soap, and nursed one another through illness. Brotherhood was born in filth. Conclusion. Hunger, soils, and the human spirit. Narrator voiceover in the trenches of World War I. The true enemy was not the one firing bullets. It was rot, rats, and rations. These men didn't just fight the enemy in front of them, they fought the conditions surrounding them. And even though they were caked in grime and starving for warmth, they survived. Somehow, they endured. When soldier boys left for the war, They left more than their neckties behind. They abandoned kitchens devoid of bread, streets without sanitation, and cities that would soon become battlefields of a different sort, those of hunger and ration, lines and creeping disease. This was the war experienced by mothers, children, and the elderly, and also they had to struggle for life. Early days, hope, rationing, and substitution. When the war began in 1914, civilians thought surely it would be over by Christmas. Cities continued, stores were open, and food was being made. But soon reality intruded. Borders were closing, imports were disappearing, food prices were soaring, food inflation and shortages. Potatoes cost 3 times as much as before the war in Germany by 1915. In France, sugar was a rare treat. In Britain, stores were already selling out of fresh fruit and butter. The housewife's job was not to make do with more, but make do with less. Substitute foods, ersatz foods, were a common part of the Central Powers' diets. German families were mixing sawdust and potato starch into their bread. Coffee was brewed from roasted barley or from acorns. Margarine or a mash of turnips was substituted for butter. In Austria-Hungary, one widely available chocolate was comprised of only flour and colored wax. Women take charge. With men gone, only nothing was asked of women but everything. They lined up for hours in ration lines, bickered over the remaining potatoes, and taught themselves to cook creatively using wartime cookbooks. Governments distributed guides, such as how to cook without meat or wartime recipes for the patriotic mother. Rationing, a bureaucracy of survival nations, differed in the way they implemented food distribution. But by 1916 to 17, most had adopted food rationing. 17 to 19, only pre-war Japan and Russia and Central European countries occupied by German or Austro-Hungarian forces. 2024, reproduced with permission of the copyright owner. Britain first resisted rationing as a way to keep morale up, instead depending on propaganda. But in 1917, German U-boats sank food imports to a trickle. 1918, ration books are established. Families were each given weekly allowances for meat, usually 4 ounces each person, sugar 8 ounces per week, butter to Oz, jam 4 ounces, tea to Oz. Germany, austerity measures already began limited rationing in 1915. But the British naval blockade led to a rapid decline in supplies. Ration cards tended to be meaningless. Stores had nothing to sell. A loaf of bread may demand 20 stamps, if at all it is obtainable. France struggled with regional inequalities. In some areas, there was ample food. In other places, people starved. Local black markets thrived. Richer families could purchase expensive illicit meat, while poor people boiled up soup using carrot peelings and potato skins. The black market, wherever rationing broke down, the black market flourished. Farmers concealed food from inspectors and sold it at illicit and wasteful price jumps. The city dweller faced being arrested for having gone in search of flour, eggs, or soap. For some, it was the only pathway to survival. Deplorable state of urban sanitation and hygiene, soap shortages, and dirt epidemics. In many regions of Europe, soap became virtually unobtainable. Governments turned animal fats and oils toward explosives and other war-related uses, cutting into civilian supplies. Public hygiene declined rapidly. Body odor became normal. Clothing wasn't washed for weeks. Parasites flourished. 3-1 public baths and laundry halls. COVID-19 disclaimer. These listings are updated on a regular basis and are based on information received from the venues, the Society for the Akron Area Arts, and the Ohio Arts Council. Public bathhouses and washing halls in many cities were closed because there was no water to heat them. In winter, families sometimes went weeks without bathing. There were few washing machines, and washing by hand in freezing water with no soap was back-breaking labor. Toilets and trash. Urban plumbing systems deteriorated. Waste disposal also slowed because of labor shortages. Garbage piled in alleys. Open sewage seemed to return in poorer areas. Rats multiplied. In cities such as Petrograd, St. Petersburg, Berlin, or Vienna, illnesses like typhus, influenza, and dysentery became ever-present dangers. The generation of war, elderly, and child survival in Angola. The hungry generation. Children suffered disproportionately. A 1919 inquiry in Berlin found that war babies averaged 2 to 3 inches shorter, 10 pounds lighter for boys, and £9 and 4 inches less for girls compared with pre-war children. Cafeterias in Vienna and Budapest closed for school lunches. Children in families received crusts of bread, watery soups, or nothing. Diseases of poverty, rickets from vitamin D, deficiency, scurvy, lack of vitamin C, pellagra, niacin deficiency, ETB, and lung infection due to reduced immunity. School closures. Several schools closed because they had no fuel for the heaters, or not enough teachers, or chalk. Others were open but children were too hungry to focus. Some fainted in class. In some parts of the Ottoman Empire, children sought food in ruins, competing with dogs, community kitchens, and government aid even, though it was in short supply and high demand. Communities and charities did what they could to help. Germany: war. Kitchens on similar lines were established in some large towns. These supplied the poor with government-subsidized meals, typically soup made from turnips and barley. Britain's national kitchens. These kitchens were established in 1917 and provided wholesome food at cost price. A family could sit down and eat for a fraction of the cost to cook at home. Menu items included stewed vegetables, liver, and onions, rice pudding. France. Municipal bakeries rationed bread. The Catholic Church put together food banks. Women's groups established milk stations for babies in cities where dairy had disappeared. Morale, propaganda, and the fight for patriotism. As hunger increased, governments began to issue propaganda to ensure that civilians behaved. British slogans: waste not, want not, eat less bread, victory depends in the kitchen, as well as the trenchism and slogans. Turnips are gold for Germany, work, don't whine. Cleanliness is next to patriotism. There were posters of women smiling over their soup pots, children enjoying bites of carrots, and farmers cast as national heroes, but behind the placards there were people in the streets collapsing with hunger. When hunger turns political, food riots began to appear increasingly often by 1916 to 1917. Germany, that turnip winter of 1916-1917, was indeed among the greatest national calamities. Poor potato harvests forced the population to depend on animal fodder turnips. Starvation rose. Women demonstrated in front of bakeries, yelling, "We want bread, not bullets." Austria-Hungary. Riots broke out in Vienna and Prague. Hungry, they began to refuse to work in the nation's munitions factories. Discontented citizens of some cities had conducted hunger demonstrations with police and troops. Russia. It was hunger that led to revolution. The February Revolution of 1917 started with a women's protest against food shortages. Bread. They howled in the Petrograd streets. Within days, the Tsar abdicated. The home front, Ottoman style. Hunger in the East tucked away from memory. The civilian crisis in the Ottoman Empire was also one of the worst. Famine in Greater Syria. 1915 to 1918. Lebanon and Syria suffered a famine, and up to 200,000 people died of starvation during the Great Famine in Mount Lebanon that was caused by blockade, with addition to other factors, like Ottoman requisitions and locust infestations. Eyewitnesses told of children dying in the streets, of people grinding tree bark for flour. Soap and water scarce. As infrastructure broke down, potable water was a luxury. Public baths closed. Laundry and hygiene practices vanished. Lice and disease followed. Conclusion: total war. Front war on all fronts. Narrator, voiceover. They didn't have uniforms, and they had never carried a rifle, but soldiers they were. All of them. The women who found morsels for hungry children from the canteens, and the boys who scavenged for bread crusts. The clans who lived in dirt and dreamt of soap. As the trenches bled, the cities desiccated, and it was all part of a continuing war machine. As trench warfare transformed the Western Front into a charnel house of mud and metal, a different kind of suffering unfolded in the East. In this place, war was a monstrous roiling tempest, consuming cities, burning villages, driving millions from their homes. Food was not just scarce, it vanished. Hygiene, a memory. This was the Eastern Front, where hunger confronted illness and war squashed. Humanity, soldier and civilian, under the weight of empire. A roadless war, logistics and food supply in the East. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, thousands of kilometers across sparsely populated expanses of land, forests, rivers, mountains and swamps. Unlike in the West, it was not a war of trench lines, instead, a war of movement, of disordered retreats and advances. The infrastructure crisis. Russia's railway network was rudimentary and overburdened. Countless supply trains were weeks late, or never got to the front at all. Entire supply lines crumbled in the mud seasons. The so-called Rasputitsa carts sank. Horses died. Soldiers spent days without food or clean water. Field kitchens that lacked heat. Russian army field kitchens didn't have enough food, utensils or equipment, and they were overrun. The rations frequently spoiled before they reached the front. Meals were rudimentary. Black bread when available. Thin cabbage soup, Sheehan millet porridge. Meat was rare. Officers dined better. Peasants and conscripts, much worse. Russian soldiers, hungry and forgotten. The average diet on a good day: 1 lb black bread, 1/2 pound milletsum, dry fish or pork, cabbage or turnip, soup, watered down tea or spirits like kvass when winter or retreats returned. Even that vanished. The troops dug for frozen roots, traded with villagers or killed their horses. Starvation in uniform. Malnutrition ravaged the Tsar's army. In reports from 1916, up to 30% of soldiers on the Eastern Front were underweight. Many also went into battle, starved and frostbitten. There were scattered accounts in some units of soldiers who collapsed from weakness before a shot was fired. Clothing and hygiene uniforms did not fit and were seldom cleaned. Lice were rampant. Soldiers went for weeks in the same delousing stations were rare. Not long after, there was little or no soap to speak of by 1916. For many soldiers, bathing once a month could even be less, if at all, a breeding ground for disease, lice, typhus, and trench fever. Lice bred in dirty uniforms and spread epidemic typhus, a fatal disease that killed more than 3 million people in Eastern Europe. During the war, 2 Russian soldiers, lice were the White Death, ubiquitous in all battalions. Poor sanitation. Latrines were makeshift and open. Water sources were contaminated. Soldiers bathed in ponds teeming with rotting bodies and animal excrement. Diarrhea and dysentery were common. Frostbite and gangrene were constant dangers. Medical facilities, almost non-existent. Russia was short of doctors and had almost no portable hospitals. The wounded soldiers, meanwhile, were abandoned to lie. For days, supplies were meager. Bandages were reused. Some patients were even operated on without benefit of anesthesia. He said, sterile environments were a fantasy. I also used civilians in the war zone. The wandering, starving Minimans Legionnaires, municipalities, squad of 10 men with rifles, FPW, as a stand-in for Gebirgsjäger squads. The refugee crisis, tens of millions of civilians, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Lithuanians, Romanians, were scattered as the war front moved to and fro. Whole villages were burned in scorched earth retreats. BR and Dumpelman have also found that cattle were slaughtered in order to starve the enemy. Wells were poisoned. Between 1914 and 1917, the Russian government had expelled more than 1 million Jews from military zones. Another 5 million civilians fled, either voluntarily or under duress. These internal refugees had no food, no shelter, and often no shoes. Food in the villages. Farmers were conscripted into the army. Crops went unharvested. Fields were trampled by armies. Russian troops and local commanders swept through villages, requisitioning grain until none was left. In Galicia, a boiled nettle and acorn flour diet sustained locals. In Romania, urban starvation resulted in rampant infant mortality, disease among the displaced. Without any hygiene infrastructure, refugee camps became killing fields. Typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis and cholera swept through. One Red Cross worker wrote, "The kids have swollen bellies from hunger. Their hair is falling out. Mothers are begging for a spoonful of salt or a crumb of bread." The Balkans, famine in the mountains, Serbia, and the Great Retreat, 1915, as Austro-Hungarian, German and Bulgarian forces routed Serbia. The entire Serbian army and hundreds of thousands of civilians retreated over the Albanian mountains. In the dead of winter, they froze, starved and killed in the thousands. Witnesses say the ground is covered in dead bodies. Macedonia and Bulgaria. Bulgarian peasants were subjected to forced labor. Food prices skyrocketed. Children were dying in the streets of Sofia. In Central Power-occupied Greece, the harvest was plundered and whole villages fell victim to cholera. Sanitation in the Balkans. With war on the march among the peasant homes, the latrines were full, the wells were dry, the soap was gone. Whole towns in occupied Serbia had no functioning sewer systems. The Austro-Hungarian army proclaimed certain regions to be infected zones and left them altogether. Austro-Hungarian anarchy, famine in an empire, multiple languages, one empty plate. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's varied population: Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Ruthenians, Croats, Bosnians, chafed under central mismanagement. Food distribution was a nightmare. Ethnic minorities sometimes got even less than second-class Austrian or Hungarian citizens. Bread riots and food protests. In 1915, hundreds of women in Prague raided bakeries. In Budapest, police fired on protesters who were angry at rising flour prices. Late in the empire, people ate bread made of sawdust, slaughtered pets and dug in the garbage. Eastward, not hygienic enough. Civilian cleanliness fails. Soap and coal were too pricey or in short supply. Bathhouses closed. Clothes weren't washed. Lice were everywhere. Typhus epidemics devastated entire sections of Polish ghettos and Ukrainian villages. Hospitals flooded. In Warsaw and in Odessa, infected people piled up in hospitals alongside. The wounded physicians ran short of clean linen. Gunshot victims were operated on dirty wooden tables. Nurses used vinegar as disinfectant. Spiritual collapse. Priests said villagers were praying to God to die. The children no longer were on the streets. The buzzing of flies over corpses became a daily sound. Revolution, famine, and civil war. Russia, the time of troubles. 1917, the first food protests. The women in Petrograd lined up for bread that never came. So that is it. On International Women's Day, March 8th, women by the thousands demonstrated for food and, with the February Revolution, ignited. The Tsar abdicated days later. The provisional government fails. Food did not improve. Despite promises, soldiers deserted. Peasants stopped sending grain. Urban hunger worsened. Bolsheviks and civil war. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks had promised peace, land, and bread, but civil war followed. Food requisitions turned brutal. Ukraine, the Volga, and Siberia were ravaged by famine. Hygiene collapsed further. Cannibalism was whispered in some corners. Conclusion: Band of Ghosts and Ashes. Narrator voiceover. There are no straight lines on the Eastern Front, only a tangle of hunger, fire, and disease. Here, empires broke under the weight of sorrow. Soldiers froze with empty stomachs. Children starved in burned villages. And the world began to change, not with one sudden disaster, but with millions of small and painful losses. This, too, was World War I. When we tell the story of the First World War, it's very commonly as a European story, but millions fought thousands of miles from the muddy ditches of France, under the African suns, in the deserts of Mesopotamia, through the swamps of Southeast Asia. These were the colonial soldiers, the porters, the laborers taken from wherever it was to feed, fight and die for empires that had annexed their land. And in this worldwide war, food and hygiene were not merely afterthoughts. They were acts of control, of resistance, of survival. Colonial conscription, feeding an empire's hunger for war. The war's second year, Britain, France, and other colonial powers had begun enlisting many times by force men from their colonies. These included, the largest of these contributed forces were the British Indian Army, 1.5 million men, the Tirailleurs, Senegalese colonial-era French African troops from West and Central Africa, Egyptian Labor Corps, Chinese Labor Corps troops, from the Maghreb, Algerian, Tunisian and Moroccan, Indo-Chinese and Malagasy. Colonials, these were not just soldiers, they were also bearers, cooks, gravediggers and sanitation workers, road builders, essential to the logistics of warfare. The rations of inequality, food hierarchies in the field separate and unequal. There were a race and rank-specific food distribution, and so, while the British and French officers dined on fresh meat, canned goods and wine, colonial troops were left with inferior provisions, many of which were unfit for the climates or the physical labor they were to endure. British Indian troops, with diets formulated to simulate religious and cultural laws, for example, rice, lentils, onions and ghee, clarified butter, goat or mutton for both Muslims and Hindus, no pork, beef, while pregnant, and even after while breastfeeding for religious reasons. You should not eat pork or beef, but when logistical problems foiled that, as they did, with some frequency, those dietary needs went out the window. Troops occasionally went days without proper food, resulting in starvation. Mutiny and spiritual dejection. African troops in Europe. French soldiers from West Africa received bread, canned meat, beans, and watery wine, but they also fell prey to stomach illnesses from food their bodies weren't used to eating. African military personnel wrote home about cold rations, spoiled meat, and long periods without hot food. Chinese labor corps, serving as they spent 10 to 12 hours a day burying bodies, constructing roads and loading supplies, and ate little more than rice, stale bread, and greasy broth. Most starved to death or died of waterborne diseases because of inadequate sanitation. Hygiene in the colonies and in non-European theaters of war. Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, among the most brutal of the war. British and Indian soldiers battled the Ottomans in scorching heat with no sanitation facilities. Dysentery, cholera, and sunstroke were deadlier than bullets. Water was frequently dirty or non-existent. At the 1916 Siege of Kut, 13,000 British and Indian soldiers were encircled, and on the brink of starvation in the desert. They consumed horses, rats, and, finally, one another. Africa War in the Shadows. In German East Africa, present-day mainland Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda, British-led campaigns, aided by armies mostly made up of African troops, marched through thousands of miles of jungle and savanna. Logistics were catastrophic. There were no supply lines. Food was looted from villages or borne on the backs of African porters. Malaria was rampant. Malaria-rich swamps were often used for drawing water. There was no lye, no soap, and no clean clothes. Those who became too sick to walk were beaten or abandoned by porters. Estimates hold that more than 100,000 African porters perished from want, disease, exhaustion. Sanitation standards for European troops, field latrines, delousing units, and soap. For colonial troops, pits dug open, no bathing, barely any medical treatment. In one camp, Black and Asian soldiers had been refused admittance to field hospitals and were simply left in crowded tents where infections were able to flourish. The campaigns of the Middle East. Sand, sickness, and scorched earths. The Gallipoli Campaign 1915. Heat, insects, and corpses rotting in the sun were challenges faced by Indian, Australian, and New Zealand forces. Food consisted of tinned bully beef and rock-hard biscuits. Water was in dangerously short supply. Many soldiers drank brackish seawater. Thousands would die of dysentery, diarrhea, and heat exhaustion. Egypt and Palestine, in the deserts of the Sinai. British campaigns were aided by the Bedouin scouts, the Indian cavalry, and the North African infantry. Tents and cooking pots became filled with sandstorms. Water had to be hauled hundreds of kilometers in barrels. The heat drew swarms of flies to both food and open wounds. Typhoid, Okomursiopias, pin-in part of the heat rapid. Ottoman troops and Arab soldiers. Many Turkish soldiers were undernourished, subsisting on hard bread, lentils, and olives. Arab tribes fighting alongside the British found little help, and occasionally looted Ottoman supply lines to stay alive. In both instances, soap was almost never provided. Men had eye infections, lice, and skin diseases, resisting and surviving. How colonial soldiers did it. These colonial soldiers, though mistreated, also developed bonds of support and camaraderie. They traded rations, innovated new methods for cooking, and did their best to perpetuate culture. Makeshift meals. Indian soldiers baked chapatis from whatever flour they could find. Senegalese soldiers made stews by combining tinned meat with wild greens. Workers from China constructed brick fire pits and had a shared rice meal. Troops from North Africa brewed mint tea in tiny kettles that they concealed from their officers. Spiritual cleansing and ritual. Without soap, ritual purity was mere symbolism. When water wasn't available, Muslim soldiers used to perform wudu ablution on the sand to disguise the stink of camp life. Hindu soldiers burned incense or herbs. African soldiers who were sick or dying called on the spirits of their ancestors. Those rituals, those meals, that shared care were not mere survival tactics. They were also acts of resistance against a system that too often treated their lives as expendable. Unremembered sacrifices. The price of silence. The forgotten dead, and as monuments in granite and marble across Europe honor soldiers. A good number of colonial troops were dumped into mass graves, or not buried at all. Tens of thousands of laborers and carriers perished anonymously, namelessly. UNCELEBRATED. Post-war betrayal. Colonial veterans were typically denied pensions, land or recognition after the war. Most returned home physically shattered, mentally traumatized and financially destitute. Famine and disease pursued them into villages already ravaged by war-induced hunger. Hygiene and health. After return, some returned home with venereal diseases or tuberculosis. Others succumbed to influenza in the 1918 pandemic, which raged across Africa and India, already enfeebled by wartime privation. Epilogue. A global war on want and inequality. Narrator. Voiceover. They fought in deserts and jungles, on coasts and riverbanks. Their food was scarce, their water poison, yet they survived, not for empire, but for one another. And forgotten by the world, they may be, but the dust beneath their boots remembers. They didn't die in battle. They weren't heroes on a monument, but they were soldiers, captured, caged, and abandoned to rot behind enemy lines. By 1918, over 8 million men had become prisoners of war, and for those who remained, the fighting was no longer with bullets but with hunger, lice, disease, and despair. The size of the captive audience, an invisible army. These figures provide some indication of the vast scale of numbers at which the former POS had to be recorded at the end of the war. At the beginning of 1917, Russia had more than 2.5 million Central Power Austro-Hungarian and German soldiers in captivity. Germany had a total of 14 million prisoners from size, British, Russian, and Belarus. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire also held hundreds of thousands of Italians. Serbs and Russians, the Allies captured tens of thousands of Germans, Ottomans, and Austro-Hungarians, 24 especially in the colonial prison camps in Egypt, India, and North Africa. At the time, the Geneva Conventions detailed some basic treatment that prisoners expected, including for food, medical attention, and correspondence with their families. Various campaign season and post-war disputations about these principles tended to ignore the truth that wartime confusion, material shortage, and ethnicist prejudice frequently cancelled them out. The camp diet, hardly enough to sustain life. Germany's camps, German POW camps, observed rules relatively well in the early years of the war. Prisoners received black bread, which is added with sawdust in some cases, thin cabbage or turnip soup, potatoes, occasional meat, scraps. But as the war ground on and the Allied blockade squeezed tighter, food grew dreadfully short, and by 1917, German civilians were near starving, so prisoners did even worse. Some lived on 800 to 1,000 calories per day, which caused them to die slender from scurvy and emaciation. Russian camps. Conditions were abysmal. Most of the POS, who were predominantly Austro-Hungarian or German, were sent to Siberian barracks with minimal infrastructure. Food consisted of dark bread, rye, 1/2 pound a day, millet, porridge, boiled cabbage or weed, soup, salted herring, or bad meat. Now and again hunger was constant, disease more so. In the wintertime, prisoners burned furniture for warmth. British and French camps. Most improved conditions, especially for senior officers. Standard rations included bread, rice, vegetables, beans, tinned meat, and on a good day, chocolate, tea and jam for British POWs, the lower ranking or colonial prisoners, and especially those from the Ottomans or African troops, were given worse food and only minimal care. Protests over undercooked food, stale bread, and hunger riots were widespread. Ottoman camps, in dire conditions, imprisoned Serbian, Arab, and British soldiers. Meals sometimes were once a day, and were rotten bread, lentil, or barley-based weak soup water, often muddy or brackish. The siege of Kut survivor with the remaining British and Indian soldiers were led into captivity by the Ottomans. Most died during forced marches and through neglect in captivity, largely through starvation and disease. Cooking behind barbed wire, desperation and ingenuity for parcels as lifelines. Despite the terrible conditions though, many POWs did manage to survive thanks to food parcels from home or from the Red Cross. British and American families sent tins of meat, tea and biscuits, chocolate, cigarettes, and condensed milk. These parcels, when they were received, were precious, to be shared, traded, hoarded, as if they were jewels or gold. In some camps, they were the survivors between life and death, but not all inmates got them. Russian and Ottoman camps frequently became isolated. Colonial prisoners rarely received anything. Improvised kitchens. Prisoners constructed their own makeshift stoves from bricks or tin cans while not working, and by the early 20th century they were allowed to buy and use kettles. Meals were sometimes communal, with prisoners sharing rations. They created trench tea made with old leaves and hot water biscuits, crushed into mush-slight stews made from wild herbs and soup, bones bread toasted over candle flames in colder climates. Snow was melted over a fire if you wanted to warm it up, for cooking or sipping. Theft and black markets. Starving prisoners stole from guards and traded among themselves or with civilian workers. Some bartered socks for food. Still others tunneled to nearby farms. Theft was severely punished, beatings, solitary confinement, or worse, good hygiene in captivity, where disease was king. Latrines and waste, crowded conditions, led toilets to overflow and sanitation systems to fail. Camps in Eastern Europe and Ottoman lands were hardly even served with the most basic facilities. Human waste contaminated drinking water. Flies transmit disease to open pits. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs. All POW camps were infested. Delousing rarely occurred. Soap was a fantasy. Clothes weren't washed for months. Skin diseases proliferated. Scabies, boils, trench foot. One French prisoner wrote, "We itch until we bleed. Under our shirts the lice are also crawling and bite us when we sleep." Medical treatment, the cruel lottery of it all. In German camps, almost no doctors and little medicine. Wounds festered in Russian camps. Prisoners built their own hospitals out of logs. Procedures were conducted with blunt knives and no anesthesia. In Ottoman camps, the prisoners received no care. Many are dying untreated in the open courtyards. Diseases included typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, scurvy, pneumonia, gangrene from untreated wounds. Women prisoners, civilian internees, and the overlooked suffering of Second World War more broadly. The principles against torture only prohibited treatment that caused very serious psychological or very serious physical harm. The poorly supplied Boer detainees, the majority of whom were male soldiers, and thousands of Boer civilian internees that would come under British control during the war. These included Germans living in France, Britain, or Russia, Tolua, Austria, civilians in occupied Belgium, Serbia, and Poland, women accused of spying or resistance, duty merchants, seamen in enemy ports. Food. In civilian internment, often worse than military camps, civilians were not honorable captives. Rations were minimal. Soup, once per day, bread full of fillers or mold, dirty water. Rarely boiled. Women were frequently called to take care of children with no milk, no diapers, and no medical support. Neglect, disease, and starvation caused many of the interned civilians to die. Mental starvation and dirty. It wasn't just physical damage. Starvation, loneliness, and filth shattered the brain. Starvation-induced hallucinations were common. Men dreamed of food, of feasts, of hot baths. Long-term camps began experiencing depression and suicide. Skin infections and lice caused people to scratch obsessively and lose sleep, having psychotic breaks. One Austrian soldier wrote, "I am not a man anymore. I am a hungry beast with the stench of dirt and fright." Moments of humanity and solidarity. Even the most dismal of camps, prisoners would find some way of preserving their dignity. Secret baths. Men boiled water in stolen tins and washed each other behind the barracks. They used ashes as soap. They shaved with broken blades. These moments were precious. Cooking clubs and prisoner gardens. In places where it was allowed, prisoners grew their onions, garlic, herbs. Cooking clubs emerged, groups that would rotate cooking, shared food. It provided men with purpose, identity, and control. International aid. The Red Cross distributed more than 20 million food parcels during the war. Those lived saved, but many never made it to the east. But when they did, they offered more than just nourishment. They offered hope, liberation, and afterwards, the broken men came home when the war ended in 1918. Not all of the POWs went home at the same time. Hundreds were held months or years as borders shifted. Governments collapsed. The journey home. There were starving men tramping in snow-covered fields. Ships brought the sick, emaciated prisoners back to ports that were unprepared for them. Many died on the way. Some were never identified. Post-war treatment. POWs who came home were often considered failures or cowards, not heroes. Their stories were silenced. Few received pensions, many experienced lifelong illnesses and trauma. Conclusion: hunger. Without glory narrative voiceover, they weren't sung about. Their names were not inscribed on arches of triumph, but in their stomachs and their skin. They carried the war in lice they scratched, in the hunger that hollowed them out, in the silence that tailed them home. This was war in a cage, a dirty, painful, lingering death the world forgot. A bullet wound wasn't necessarily the end. For World War I, it was often only the beginning. Survival was a matter not just of luck or medicine, but of mud, cleanliness, and the hands that could, or could not, save you. That was the world. Behind the trenches, a purgatory of screams, sores, and silence. The fear in front line, the immediacy of dirt, blood, and decay. Battlefield wounds. Battlefield deaths were rare. Bullets or shrapnel, or bayonets, struck them, and they fell into the mud, where they would be worked over by time, by the mire, by infection. Wounds were often packed with dirt, manure, or garments particles left in the cold, wet for hours or even days, untreated, or packed in unclean bandages to transport types of common injuries. Shrapnel wounds, jagged, easily infected. Glassy. Doctor reviews of surgeries gone wrong in bullet injuries, bullet passing through limbs, internal bleeding at times. Classic operation. Book. Trench. Foot decay of feet due to immersion in water gas. This kills. Burns in eyes, lungs, on skin. Bayonet injuries, deep and prone to contamination. The war to end all wars. The birth of the field hospital system. From trenches to treatment, soldiers were transported along a long, frenzied chain of care. The evacuation route, regimental, aid, post-rap, nearest to the trenches, frequently a dugout or minimal attention, bandaging and morphine treatment. Advanced dressing station adds, a tent or shell-damaged building several kilometers back from the lines. Just a little more care, dressing wounds, staunching bleeding, casualty clearing. Station CCS, the first proper hospital with trained staff, operating areas, and beds. Critical cases operated on here. Base hospitals, away from the front. Recovery or amputation occurred, typically in France, Belgium, Egypt, or Britain. But the journey to a base hospital could last days, and many perished long before they arrived. Surgeries. On the edge, surgery without cleanliness, new kind of war surgery. Surgery before WWI was often clean, internal, and careful. But trench warfare changed everything. Surgeons had to amputate, rapidly extract shrapnel-embedded faces local to the abdomen, and scoloprate in muddy, open-air tense work without sterile gloves, gowns, or instruments, at least at the start of the war. Infection was inevitable. Even basic sanitation was lacking. Common causes of death included gas, gangrene, bacteria flourishing in wounds ate away tissue with lethal sepsis, poisoning of the blood from instruments with uncleaned blood, or a wait for treatment, tetanus, commonly present in wounds contaminated with soil. Surgeons often worked by candlelight. Amputation was routine, sometimes taking under 10 minutes. Pain relief, chloroform and ether were available but often limited. Those were given morphine for serious cases. Many of the operations took place with patients semi-conscious or wide awake and being restrained. Just the other day. Trench hygiene, a losing fight. Toilets, latrines, shallow holes in the ground, with wood around them. Parking of the carts near dwellings or kitchens was one source of risk. Overflowed in rain, spread disease, drawing rats and flies, which further spread the infectious water. Transported in canvas buckets or old petrol cans. Contaminated, rarely boiled. 2 copper cups for men to wash with. Clean wounds, wash clothes, and drink. Delousing stations. These were troop showers called lousy corners, a mobile bath with boiling or chemically heated water, but not always accessible. Soap was rare. Uniforms frequently went unwashed for weeks. All soldiers in the trenches had lice. They itched constantly. Trench fever, headache, and profound exhaustion was transmitted by lice. The diseases of dirt, trench foot, mouth, and more trench foot, attributable to continuous wet. Cold weather symptoms, numbness, blisters, swelling, the rotting of the skin in the most severe cases, amputation of toes or feet. Preventives, changing socks, rubbing feet with whale oil can't always be done. Trench mouth, necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis, extremely painful gum disease due to bad oral care. malnutrition and stress. Soldiers were unable to take solid food, bled from their gums, and developed pus-covered ulcers. Other common diseases: scabies, ringworm, typhus from lice. Bilious rapid is a consequence of dysentery due to bad food and water, influenza and pneumonia. Women at the front: angels of mercy, witnesses of horror, VADs, and nurses. Thousands of women worked as nurses in the trenches and hospitals. British VADs, Voluntary Aid Detachment, French Red Cross nurses, and American Angels of Mercy bandaged wounds, consoled dying men, shivered in the same cold, caked with as much dirt, and feared the same things. They cleaned woundsmen screaming whilst being held down during amputations, feed and fended, and had hons not on, slept out in the open in tents near rats and stacks of bodies, and still they were seldom credited. Many went home in a traumatized condition, often taking with them almost no money. Shell shock and starvation, mental degeneration and physical decay. Shell shock, brought on by being constantly bombarded, dying, and fearing symptomatology, tremors, blindness, mutism, paralysis, and nightmares, often misdiagnosed as cowardice, treated through jolts of electricity or time. Alone, malnutrition and wasting. Even on the Western Front, soldiers frequently received insufficient rations, hardtack, bully beef, tinned beans, lacked fresh vegetables or fruit, resulted in scurvy, fatigue, weight reduction, and depression. Soldiers' teeth fell out, gums bled, energy faded, skin broke down. Their homes were the war's second battlefield. Medical breakthroughs amid the blood, for all the horror of it. World War I helped medicine advance. Thomas Splint changed therapy of fractures overnight and preserved thousands of limbs. Antiseptic surgery, carbolic acid, iodine, and sterile instruments were in use everywhere. By 1917, X-rays, contrast medium, also used for locating a bullet or shrapnel in the body. First time in mobile situation. Miller, Dr. Robertson, and blood transfusion units. Blood transfusion units, introduced by Condian surgeon Dr. Lawrence Bruce Robertson. Plastic surgery, developed in Britain by Harold Gillies for reconstructing facial trauma and burns. Even so, none of that altered what was true for most. Crude procedures, dirt, and rags for bandages, no anesthesia, no soap. The Warrior and the Ward. Final installment. Narrator, voiceover. The war didn't stop in the trench. It lingered in the hospitals of mud, the silent hell of disease, the sour stink of decay and antiseptic. This wasn't the war of glory or flags. This was the war of pails of limbs, of silent screams, of a hygiene neglected and humanity challenged. The trenches constituted a front line, yes, but so did the kitchens, the alleys, the frigid corners of the silent cities. While soldiers battled and bled overseas, civilians fought their own war of starvation, disease, and exhaustion, in factories, in breadlines, in crowded tenements and frozen villages. This was life on the home front. Civilians at war. The silent army. World War I put entire societies, not just armies, in motion. While millions of men rushed off to fight in the war, the civilian populations of Europe were left to feed themselves with dwindling supplies, work in dangerous munitions factories, care for the wounded, rear children in a climate of rising prices, sickness and mourning. Governments described it as total war, and for civilians, that typically meant the complete breakdown of normality. Rationing starts. Bread cards and black markets. Britain was heavily dependent on imported food at the start of the war. German U-boats immediately sunk supply ships, causing food shortages, panic buying, rising prices. Britain introduced voluntary rationing in 1917. By 1918, it became compulsory. Citizens received ration books for sugar, meat, butter, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. The situation was far worse. Food and fertilizer were also prevented from entry by blockades from the Royal Navy. In 1915, Germans were already subsisting on mock bread, sawdust, or turnip, or straw. Get key ersatz.publisher-domain:85218.entries. Mock bread, sawdust. Key: 85218.entries 241201200. Mock bread, straw: key: 85218.entries: EJ 2002_4_008. mock-bread.key:85218.entries:80photo.86s turbi mockbread:key:85218.entries 871009n4.mock-bread.load.txt.pubdate equals 30-09-1359.mock-bread.docs-date body.1996-07-010.links refs date sidebar.20.links.idea.19 main.body.3.mock.bread.snippet.query-string trap opening parenthesis field publication group key 9 dork4 3 qvp1 f4 JJAU74 HCG XPDE RN JHZOC4 HYMGZ 56G mockbread:key:85218.entries: 871009 n4.mock-bread.docs-date body.1996-07-010.links refs date sidebar.20.links.idea.19 main.body.3.mock.bread.thumb is nu der Ersatz aus Schlechscancer oder Stroh infusions other than coffee made from ground or roasted barley or from roasted acorns meat on the table only on feast days and largely horse meat. Then came the turnip winter of 1916. Potatoes in storage froze. People survived on boiled turnips for weeks. Malnutrition set in. So did disease, hunger, riots, and food protests across Europe. Citizens started to resist starvation. Berlin, 1915 to 1917. Women in long queues would loot bakeries and markets. Children demonstrated in the streets with empty bowls. Vienna, 1918. The police fought angry mothers demanding milk and potatoes. Petrograd, St. Petersburg, 1917. Scarcity of food was a spark that ignited the Russian Revolution. The Tsarist regime broke down with the storming of factories by women who demanded bread. Rome, Paris, Barcelona, everyone witnessed unrest in their civilian populations in connection with hunger. Governance struggled to maintain control. Soldiers might be posted to guard bakeries and quell bread riots. The war kitchen, the war furnace, and the war horse and jockey, containing their history, proper management, diseases, and treatment, a reference handbook of the diseases of the horse, their symptoms, causes, and treatment PFMs, women and war work, the drought and the flood PFM, photography illustrate 4, JPG women and war work, recollections and experiences 22 until, the drought and the flood from, the war kitchen, the war horse and jockey, containing their history, proper management, diseases, and treatment, with authentic racing records, MHACH Hyder, Anna Hubbard Hyder, Emory Events, Life-of-Anna-H-Hyder, HTML Women and War Work, a record of work in wartime, personnel data, family source.pdf, 1 image 7. As men disappeared to fight, women around the country became the workforce behind the workforce in the war. Factory workers. Retrospectively, there were thousands of women who went to work in munitions plants and dealing with TNT and acids and all the explosives. This really was dangerous work. The chemicals discolored their skin yellow and they were known as canary girls. Some were left with chemical burns, miscarriages, or long-term illness. Farm workers in Britain and France. The Women's Land Army replaced men on farms and planted crops. Food production in Germany fell also. Now the men as well as the women had been marched off to war. Nurses and hospital aides. Women set up field hospitals, tended to the wounded and bathed soldiers crawling with lice and covered with blood. Household survivalists. Beyond this, the women needed to ration food, make soap, boil water and look after children in frozen apartments or homes in the country. An early life under the thumb of war children contended with a war that was silent, slow and deadly. Food was sometimes restricted for adults and working troops. Children went without. Add to that, milk was a luxury, eggs were a luxury, fresh vegetables were a luxury. Schools shut down for lack of heat, for flu, for bombing diseases such as rickets, scurvy, and typhoid rose in slums and tenement housing. In most towns, it was scavenger children who collected coal, bits of food, or paper with which to barter for bread. Many quit school to toil in factories or on farms. To disease and bad sanitation in wartime cities, public hygiene collapses. Stressed cities couldn't keep up with the basics of sanitation. Bathhouses were shut down because of the fuel shortage. Soap became expensive or unavailable. Garbage collection services limited or frozen, or neglected water pipes were allowed to freeze or break. In cities such as Berlin, Warsaw, Vienna, and Petrograd, clogged sewers and the stench of unwashed bodies became the rule. Epidemics and illness, typhus, transmitted by lice, felled tens of thousands of people in Eastern Europe. Tuberculosis flourished in overcrowded apartments there. 1918 flu pandemic ravaged an already debilitated society. Millions died. Most of them children, and old people. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors were at the front. The void was filled with home remedies, superstition and herbal medicine. Making do alternatives, bartering, and resourcefulness. Civilians adapted in desperate ways. Food substitutes. Germany, substitute coffee, sawdust, bread, mock chocolate made from turnips. Austria, dog, zoo animals eaten in Vienna. France, chicory root as coffee, acorn flour in baking. Rucha bark, pine needles, or fermented cabbage as an alternative to grain. Bartering networks, shoe for flour and soap for milk, were passed between housewives. Black markets sprouted in every city, shielded by either bribes or knives. Boys stole coal from trains to sell for bread. Homemade hygiene, animal fat and wood ash soap. Lice combs made of bone or wood. Women also shared boiled water to bathe babies in communal buckets. The urban versus rural divide. It was a different story in the countryside where, overloaded though they were, farmers and shepherds did not do too badly. Some rural families could raise vegetables or chicken and could barter with their neighbors. Sending city children to rural relatives became a common practice. Others hoarded grain or slaughtered livestock without authorization to keep the state from confiscating it. But in places, especially Eastern Europe and the Balkans, rural life itself collapsed with military occupation and scorched earth tactics. Psychic impact, despair and social disintegration. Suicides increased, particularly among the elderly and single mothers. Alcoholism rose among the men remaining behind or returning home. Wounded. Mental health was never talked about, but secretly deteriorated in homes from where fathers never made it back. Children starved and mothers wept in dark kitchens. Many families never recovered, not just physically, but emotionally. Relief efforts and limitations. International aid was scarce during the war, but some organizations did make a difference. Red Cross societies donated food, parcels and medicines. American food shipments made their way to Belgium and portions of France, and civilians were able to live through the most intense winters. Religious groups and volunteer-run soup kitchens set up in cities throughout Europe, dishing up thousands of meals a day, but it would take much more, and in many places, the help never came. Conclusion. The other war. Starvation beyond the frontline. Narrator voiceover. Soldiers dodged bullets. Civilians risked hunger. Their enemies were silence and scarcity, and the sound of children crying over tonight's empty bowls. In tenement alleys, in cold country houses, in factories and fields, they fought a war without medals or a victory parade, and their fight, too, should be remembered. The war was fought not only with bullets and bombs, but it played out on posters, headlines, slogans, and soup bowls. During World War I, governments discovered that hunger could provoke rebellions and filth could turn an army to rot from within, and thus was fought a second front, the war of hearts, minds, and stomachs. The Propaganda das System der Lügen, the system of lies and perception management. Food, as a weapon of influenced governments, had known from the war's early days that food was political. Who had it and who didn't could tip the balance of the war. Posters in Britain and France asked for rationing as not a necessity, but a patriotic duty. Save the wheat, help the fleet, eat less, and make other people eat less. In Germany and Austria, government publications minimized shortages and branded ersatz, substitute food, as positive new products, the results of innovation, not desperation. In the United States, which joined the war in 1917, the government created the United States Food Administration, headed by Herbert Hoover. He popularized meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, victory gardens, civilians growing vegetables to supplement the war effort, posters, pamphlets, and public messaging propaganda campaigns targeted mothers and wives to cook thriftily and maintain clean homes in the face of shortages. Children, how to grow food and save soap motor skills taught at home while we were banned from work. 047. Workers, remember, you need to be well and clean to keep up national productivity. Examples included a France poster of a well-scrubbed family dinner table. Cleanliness is patriotism. A German leaflet admonishing against the sharing of food waste is treason. British handbills that warned citizens not to buy from black markets. Your greed feeds the Kaiser. Soap, water, and national identity. Even bathroom habits were a source of national pride. German newspapers taunted British soldiers as filthy Tommies with bad teeth and lice-infested uniforms, though German shortages later even further deteriorated hygiene among their own troops. British propaganda suggested that the clean soldier is the strong soldier, and distributed illustrated pamphlets on how to wash feet, brush teeth, look after uniforms and tattoos, even when water was a rarity. Cleanliness equals strength. Governance spread this story not only to safeguard health, but also to raise morale, reduce the risk of desertion, and encourage people to see poor hygiene as an expression of discipline, feeding the troops what was said and what really happened, what was true on paper. Soldiers ate well. Military rations menus were often quaint. Britain pledged 4,000 calories a day, relatively subtle with care to diet. Germans fed their prisoners of war with well-balanced meals that included meat, bread, and vegetables. France included daily wine, rations, new bread, meat, and kasha grain porridge were Russia. But in reality, supplies were delayed. Cooks lacked ingredients or training. Food rotted in transfer portions, or none at all went to the soldiers. But posters depicted smiling soldiers huddled over full bowls of stew, as if all was well. Morale depended on illusion. Food as propaganda against the demonization through diet. Allied pamphlets said Germans boiled horse bones for soup and ate zoo animals. British hoarding of colonial food in the face of living British children. People starving was the chargeable against the British by German media. To the Russian revolutionaries, it was Tsarist officers drinking wine as peasants gnawed on bark. To feed the enemy was synonymous with betrayal. Prisoner and soldiers who were found trading rations were punished. Even Red Cross parcels were occasionally confiscated under suspicion. Home hygiene campaigns, clean cities for a dirty war Britain. Soap and toothbrushes were given out by the health boards in the slums. Posters advised boiling water and scrubbing. Children's nail school examinations became more stringent. Dirty uniforms could result in suspensions. Germany introduced public cleaning days, during which citizens were coaxed into scrubbing homes and stairwells. Public bathing facilities for civilians in dense urban environments. Austria-Hungary and Russia faced logistical collapse. The propaganda droned on, of course, but real soap and water became inaccessible. Empty slogans boomed through bombed-out streets and fetid tenement slums where typhus traveled easily. Yet governments maintained that a clean nation was a strong one. Civic pride was channeled into hygiene at gunpoint. Censorship and the reality gap. Governments were censoring letters to all from the front and home that mentioned starvation, dirty wounds, lack of soap, disease outbreaks. Soldiers were only allowed to write happy reports, many self-censored so as not to alarm family members, but some secretly described dish, rats, and boot leather soup latrines, so dirty men would not eat near them. Water so filthy that dysentery spread within days. Truth became dangerous. In some countries, one risked arrest for spreading defeatist rumors. Morale, nutrition, and mental health. Hunger as a psychological weapon. As rations diminished, so did morale. Malnourished soldiers were less alert, more anxious, hallucinated, or irrational. Anger, soap and spirit, clean clothes, and a hot wash could restore dignity and hope, at least temporarily. Softer stations, some units reported, had lower desertion and suicide rates. Letters home. Troops with longing for bread, tea, hot baths. Families shipped soap, sugar cubes, and socks with attached love notes. Well, this is a grand send-off, but really, missives like yours are most invaluable. You want to know what we need. I have just returned from our run down the line, and Pear's soap finder, the 100th time. More precious than gold. I was just smelling it for hours before I used it. War gardens, national kitchens, and organized survival victory gardens UK, US. The public was urged to plant vegetables in yard, school grounds, public parks. National kitchens, France, Germany, neighborhood-wide. Communal soup kitchens began to feed entire neighborhoods with the few ingredients available to them. These kitchens supplied overworked mothers with pre-cooked food. Surplus, industrial stoves, and centralized rationing also were used as stages for propaganda speeches and posters. Messages: the state feeds you, the state protects you. After the war, propaganda changed the reality. After 1918, the victorious powers celebrated survival, not suffering. Posters of heroic nurses took the place of images of gangrenous wounds. The smiling, soutane-clad men with the amputated legs weren't out on the street begging. The memory of hunger was hidden under parades in peace. Treaties. Political upheavals in Germany and Austria, driven by shortages of food, were followed by economic disarray. The photograph of the starving child entered post-war aid campaigns, but also nationalist anger that resurfaced in subsequent wars. Conclusion: the mind eats. To narrator voiceover: you don't win war on the empty belly, but if your people stop believing, you can lose one. So they were fed with more than food, with stories, slogans, and dreams of warmth and plenty. In World War I, propaganda kept morale high, even when rations were absent, and in the silence after, truth went hungry while the posters smiled. Beyond bullets and bombs, beyond hunger and fatigue, there loomed an enemy even more deadly than any army: disease. In the muddy trenches, rife with vermin, of World War I, viruses and bacteria flourished. But that was no match for the horror that came in 1918, a pandemic that would ultimately kill more people than the war itself. A perfect storm: war as driver of disease. Although World War I was a conducive environment for infectious diseases to spread, crowded trenches and camps, thousands of men jammed into godawful mud and filth, and airless barracks, malnourishment and fatigue, compromised immune systems and ill health wore down soldiers and civilians. Mass military movements. Troops moved around continents, mingling populations and bringing diseases. Unhygienic conditions and sanitation, lack of latrines, pollution of water sources, an epidemic of lice. Overwhelmed medical systems. Overrun hospitals can have difficulty isolating and treating contagious patients. These, in combination, merely amplified the most ordinary ailments, like typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and prepared the ground for the deadliest scourge of all, common diseases of the waterfis. Typhus, which spread by lice, was epidemic in Eastern European armies and POW camps. Symptoms: high fever, rash, delirium. Mortality was extremely high in untreated patients, between 10 to 60%. Outbreaks in Russia and the Balkans killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians on both sides. Dysentery, as a consequence of dirty water and food poisoning. Soldiers had severe diarrhea, dehydration, and been very weak, often fatal without proper treatment. Tuberculosis, TB, in crowded cities and barracks. TB, a slow killer, weakened the health of millions during and after the war. Active TB was common phenomenon in many of the soldiers who fell to stress. Bad food. Trench fever. Symptoms included severe leg pain, fever, and fatigue, and the condition was caused by lice bites, though seldom fatal. It left thousands prostrate and spreading fast in filthy camps. The 1918 flu pandemic. The Spanish flu, the deadliest outbreak in history. In the last year of the war, a new strain of influenza broke loose, which spread rapidly across the globe, killing an estimated 50 million people. Dubbed the Spanish flu because Spain, neutral in the war, reported cases freely, while other countries censored news. Unlike ordinary flu, it killed previously healthy young adults in their prime, not just the very young and very old. The worst affected were soldiers in the trenches, in densely populated military camps, and from in-hospitals. The flus spread in the trenches. Rapid spread. Virus was taken around the world by troop movements through Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. With crowded barracks and poor ventilation in large gatherings, furtioning could occur quickly. Sick soldiers flooded the medical staff. Symptoms and mortality. People would fall ill with a rapid high fever, intense cough, and outright bleeding from the lungs. Pneumonia or respiratory failure would frequently lead to death within days. The death rate in certain army units was 20 to 40%. Impact on the war. Entire battalions became incapacitated, already worn down by battle and by hunger. The flu sapped the strength of armies. Some historians say it helped bring the war to a close by undermining military effectiveness. Civilians and the flu. Pandemic civilians were not immune to the flu pandemic. Cities with inadequate sanitation and crowded housing experienced huge death tolls. Hospitals were overwhelmed and understaffed. In weeks, many families lost multiple members. Public health responses, quarantines, and closures of schools, theaters, and public gatherings were common, but unevenly enforced. Masks were required in certain areas, particularly in the US. Soap, clean water and rest were prescribed, though were frequently unavailable. Disease control. The relevance of hygiene while shortages, of course, were the name of the game. The importance of striving for better hygienic conditions was paramount. The troops were urged to wash their hands, bathe when they could, and disinfect their clothes. Camps set up delousing stations with the use of chemicals such as gasoline or creosote in some of the blocks. The management of latrines improved, and measures were taken to ensure there was no water contamination. But chronic shortages of soap, clean water and medicine undermined these steps. The aftermath disease and its long shadow, the pandemic had an impact, and it was lasting. Numerous survivors sustained permanent injuries to their respiratory and nervous systems. An already depleted population again fell ill with tuberculosis. Public health systems in Europe were ordered to modernize, to be ready for future outbreaks. Personal accounts. Voices from the flu. Reading from a soldier's letter. I was healthy last month. Now I cough blood and can't breathe. Friends next to me have died in the night. We are prisoners not of bullets, but of a disease no one can see. From a nurse's diary. The flu travels faster than any wound. The dying masses across our tents, and we have nothing left to give but prayer. Conclusion. The deadly double threat. Narrator voiceover. On the blood-drenched battlefields of the time, soldiers met an enemy they could not shoot or pierce with a bayonet. The influenza pandemic of 1918 scythed its way across the world. A greater killer than the guns of the Great War. In the fight for life, disease could be as ruthless as any enemy, illustrating just how important food, sanitation, and medication really were, and just how frail humans could be without them. Millions of soldiers from Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean were sucked into the vast machinery of World War I. They fought alongside European armies, yet still they were treated as fundamental inferiors, particularly with respect to food and hygiene. For those men, the war was not just one war against a foe, but against intolerance, harsh weather, and starvation. The scale of colonial involvement until today, more than 1.5 million Indian soldiers had fought. In the British Indian Army, some 200,000 African soldiers were drafted to serve in French and British armies. There were also many Caribbean, Australian, New Zealand, and Southeast Asian soldiers who served in key capacities. These men fought everywhere: Western Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia. Food challenges. Insufficient and inaccurate provisions. In general, European armies served out meals that were made to suit the average European's cup of tea and dietary requirements. Colonial soldiers often received sustenance that didn't resemble what they were used to eating: rice, millet, a scarcity of fruits, vegetables, and sources of protein so critical to their health. On occasion, in lack of special spicing or other condiments, it is rendered repugnant to taste. In many instances, far worse rations than European troops. Indian troops, for instance, ordered additional rice, lentils and ghee, clarified butter, but would be served heavy bread or hard biscuits instead. Cultural and religious dietary restrictions. Religious practices was uneven. Hindu soldiers required vegetarian meals. Muslim troops needed halal food. Sikhs and other communities had dietary customs. There was rarely enough time, or there were logistical constraints to cover these needs, and very often they were not met in an adequate or consistent manner. Starvation, physical and mental distress, and low morale were widespread. Dwelling conditions and cleanliness. A fight with surroundings and the shabby upkeep. A majority of colonial troops were in climates very different from what they were used to. African troops, parachuted into the cold, muddy trenches of Europe, struggled to adapt. Indian soldiers campaigned during bone-chilling winters, lacking sufficient warmth and shelter. Among those who served in the Middle East and Africa, Mud, breakouts, malaria and dysentery were commonplace. Hygiene facilities were often inferior. Tents and barracks that were crowded and had poor drainage. Access to clean water and soap is limited. Delousing efforts, sporadic or insufficient. Some troops who had to share latrines with enemy prisoners or local civilians. Health, sickness, starvation, and weariness. Colonial soldiers were hit hard by disease, malaria, dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections. Malnutrition also made immune systems fragile, leading to vulnerability. Fatigue was rife, as working conditions, diet, and rest were harsh and unsatisfactory. Discrimination and its effect on morale. Colonial troops gave this, but they usually endured. Segregation from European units, lower quality, supplies and equipment, inadequate medical treatment relative to their European fellow countrymen. Officers and fellow soldiers with racial prejudice. This differential treatment exacerbated the wounds beyond the physical. Trust, cohesion and willingness to fight included acts of resilience and community. Colonial soldiers shared close-knit communities, despite their many hardships, exchanging food and spices to replicate home meals, organizing religious services and cultural activities to keep spirits up, educating on sanitary practices based on European techniques and folk wisdom. Indian troops even cultivated little gardens around their camps in order to supplement their rations with fresh vegetables. Legacy and recognition. Tens of thousands of colonial veterans did so after the war. Little recognition or support, neglected, war pensions or healthcare. Societies that are still organized by colonial hierarchies, but their experiences in the war sowed the seeds of change, feeding early nationalist movements and demands for rights and dignity. Conclusion: the invisible sacrifice. Narrator voiceover. Colonial soldiers were wounded not just by bullets, but by neglect and discrimination. Their fight with hunger, filth and disease was one fought in silence, wiped largely from history's pages. But their resolve determined not only the fate of the Great War, but the future of nations. Their story is another important piece of the truth about food, hygiene and survival in World War I. Necessity is the mother of invention. War's demands are often cruel, producing inventive results. The grinding horrors of World War I compelled both armies and civilians to innovate, to try to preserve precious food, to combat disease, and to improve hygiene under impossible conditions. From canned meals to antiseptic innovations, the Great War inspired advances in practices that still endure today. Canning and food preservation. The rise of canned food. Before WWI, canned food was both expensive and confined largely to navies. The war sped up mass production of canned meat, vegetables and soups, feeding millions. Canned foodstuffs such as bully beef, corned beef, and canned peas were a staple for soldiers. Governments created huge factories, specializing in vacuum-sealed cans that could withstand shipping and extended preservation. Challenges: and early cans were known to leak or explode during shipping. The quality of food was mixed. Some cans contained spoiled contents or were inadequately cooked. The troops were getting tired of the same canned meals, so troops began asking for some variety. Dehydrated and preserved foods. Emerging technologies: dehydrated soups and powdered milk, compact biscuits for lowering weight and loss. Freeze-drying was in its experimental infancy, but work started in this era. Concentrated soups and beverages were employed by soldiers to supplement meager rations. Portable cooking and heating. Portable stoves for field kitchens were also introduced, which further sped up meal-making. Improvements in fuel storage and delivery made it possible to serve hot meals up a line, but fuel shortages and logistical hurdles prevented extensive adoption. Sanitation. Innovations improved latrine design field. Engineers designed improved trench latrines with drainage pits to limit contamination. Portable latrines and waste disposal units were trialed in camps for a hygienic disposal of waste. Water purification. When there was fuel, boiling water became standard, but other solutions were required. Chemical purification tables, chlorine-based, began to be used, but only in small quantities. Filtering methods, developed for combating water diseases. Antiseptic and surgical advances. The value of such antiseptics as iodine, carbolic acid, and hydrogen peroxide was acknowledged and became universally accepted in field hospitals. Surgeons refined procedures for sterilizing instruments, cutting infection rates. The war also introduced rubber gloves and gowns, which improved surgical hygiene, personal hygiene supplies. Governments made large amounts, often rationing it, for soldiers and the civilian population. Toothpaste, toothbrushes and shaving kits soon became standard military issue in many armies. The troops were taught foot care to prevent things like trench foot. Medical supplies and field kits, standard well-stocked first aid kits containing antiseptics and bandages and morphine were created. Field dressings became better at stopping bleeding and protecting wounds. Nurses and medics were drilled in rigorous hygiene protocols. Public health campaigns and education. Governments began public education campaigns to teach civilians and soldiers the basics of good hygiene, stressing hand washing, clean water and safe food handling. Posters and leaflets featuring pictures educated the public in numbers of different languages. After the Chicago fire of 1871 reduced the city to a pile of cinders, schools began teaching hygiene as part of the curricula. Impact on civilian life. So a lot of the technology developed during the war filtered into civilian life after 1918, as canning and food preservation trickled down to households. Normal eating changed. Public health gains helped prevent outbreaks of disease in cities. Hygiene instruction informed standards of sanitation policy and practice. Limitations and lessons. Learned soldiers and civilians alike continued to die in large numbers from lack of hygiene and bad food. Supply chain problems, expense and logistical challenges had typically stunted the broad adoption of the innovations. The war had emphasized the need for continuous research in the fields of nutrition, sanitation, and disease prevention. Conclusion. Progress born of necessity. Narrator, voiceover, and from the grime of the trenches and the hunger of the home front came innovations that saved lives, not just during the war, but years after the last artillery shell had been fired. World War I was a crucible of invention, as desperate need to feed and clean and heal intensified innovation that now permeates our lives. As the guns fell silent and soldiers laid down their arms, the world confronted the monumental task of healing, of restoring health and well-being not only to the obvious wounds of war, but also to the less visible wounds of hunger, disease, and neglect. The history of food and hygiene in World War I is a story not just of survival, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the relentless human spirit. The devastation left behind. Millions of fighters came home without limbs or with chronic diseases and emaciated bodies from malnutrition and disease. Civilians whose lives were not scooped away by hunger or epidemics arrived to find their families broken and their economies destroyed. Urban and rural areas alike struggled to reconstruct infrastructure that had been destroyed by war and forgotten over decades. Public health intervention and social transformation. Experience of war taught harsh lessons about hygiene and nutrition and prompted widespread reform. Governments increased spending on sanitation infrastructure, on sewers, on clean water, on public baths to fend off future epidemics. Nutrition science, meanwhile, was newly significant, helping to shape school meals, welfare programs, and public health campaigns. Healthcare for veterans grew, haltingly, recognizing that the cost of war extended beyond the battlefield. Food security and agricultural shifts to war revealed vulnerabilities in global food supply chains and reliance on imports. In several countries, self-sufficiency and mechanization of agriculture was encouraged. Victory gardens and homegrown food remained a permanent fixture in civilian life. Cultural memory and commemoration. Literature, art, and public discourse were impacted by the collective memory of hunger and disease in wartime. With memorials and museums, stories began to be told, not only of battles, but of the fights over food and hygiene. The survivors' voices preserved the human face of suffering, lost in grand histories. The human spirit, amid hardship, although countless have suffered unimaginable fates. Stories of kindness, resourcefulness, and perseverance are plenty. Nurses who tended without end, soldiers who subsisted on scanty scraps, civilians who invented ways to feed their families, communities that reaffirmed connections through shared sacrifice and perseverance, a reminder that there can be light even in darkness. Lessons for the future. World War I reminds us of the importance of food security and public health, particularly in crises. But it also warns of the disastrous results of failing to, if not. It's a story that glorifies the triumph of ingenuity, teamwork, and empathy over disaster. Closing reflection area. Voiceover. Food and hygiene might appear routine, mundane aspects of everyday life. Yet at war, they are lifelines. The Great War taught us that no amount of weapons in the world can make up for the damage of no care at all for the people who used them, in feeding and cleaning and healing them. To remember this is more than history. It is a call to treasure and protect those basic needs that are the bedrock of our collective well-being.